Hey everyone, what a pleasure it is to be here with Jeff Morrison, Vice President, Global Purchasing and Supply Chain at General Motors. Jeff is responsible for the company's global purchasing, supply chain, and logistics across the world. And he came into the role April 2022, and what a 15 months that's been. Jeff, this is a bit of a reunion for us. I haven't seen you for a little while. I think about 10 years since you were in logistics.
Yes.
So it's been quite a journey since then. But I'd really appreciate you taking some time with me and to share your insights with our global audience.
No, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Jeff, supply chain is sort of top of the agenda these days, and the headlines and boardrooms. It's certainly been a turbulent time since you came into the role, whether chip shortages, supply chain disruption, inflation, but at the same time, this transformation, ramping up EV and battery, transition to net carbon zero. What are some of the significant progress you'd point to? Where has the team made the most strides?
You know, it's funny. I used to have to explain to people what supply chain was and what we did, and I don't really have to explain that anymore since it's really all over the place and lots of interest from politicians, investors, and obviously the leaders in the company. I started in April, and I would say April was an interesting month because that coincided with actually, as we looked through the COVID lockdowns, that was the month that China and Shanghai specifically instituted lockdowns there. And so fragile period already from a supply chain standpoint, and really, kind of kicked off this 7-week period of uncertainty and really trying to figure out how we were going to keep building parts and where the constraints and bottlenecks were. So, for me, it was the end of a pretty long period of time that we managed these COVID disruptions around the world as they happened and tried to keep supply going. And so it was kind of the exclamation point at the end of the sentence, right? That said, okay, here's one last rally. And so since that point, we've really been focused on how do we stabilize the supply chain and how do we really kind of get to this next more normal phase. And so a lot of premium freight, trying to move material around, making sure that we had part availability, helping suppliers get back up and running and get to their full manpower levels, get our schedule stabilized, get our vehicle build stabilized, get our shipments to dealers stabilized. And that's, I would say, really the focus has been how do we get back to a more normal laminar flow.
So it's taken a while to perhaps get back to basics, but hopefully we're a little bit more there. Where do you still have a ways to go?
So the big focus, obviously, the last couple of years has really been the semiconductor crisis, and that is largely better, although I always like to describe it as fragile. It's there's still areas and nodes that are constrained and limited, and so we're really having to keep a lot of focus there to make sure that we stay engaged and understand what those are and work with our partners to make sure that we're getting the supply that we need. Also making sure that all of our tiered suppliers are keeping up with their orders and making sure that the translation of what we need to build versus what's getting ordered and committed to is there. So I would say that continues to be a focus. We're really having the opportunity now to spend more energy looking ahead, and the look ahead is really EVs. So how do we get ready for this ramp up that we have coming at us, getting all the battery production that we need, getting all the critical minerals that we need, and really being able to bring incredible vehicles to market here pretty quickly. And then this other major trend of just this disruption in the vehicle of software and the changes to the electrical architecture and what's involved there. So those are probably the two main areas from a supply chain standpoint I'm focused on.
Yeah, I think you were being a bit modest in the first 15 months because there's been some, we'll talk about it, there's been some pretty significant partnerships and accomplishments there already. I want to just turn to logistics performance, though, for a moment. Obviously, we have a very engaged logistics supply chain management audience paying a lot of attention. Where would you put logistics performance in terms of your priorities, given you're looking across a global organization and supply chain right now?
Yeah, so I would say, from a material standpoint, it's largely stabilized. We had when I came in about 15 months ago, we were seeing a lot of issues on global ocean mainly, and high rates and difficulty moving the cargo that we needed to. Because of the disruptions, we were in air a lot, so having to manage air freight. That's largely stabilized, and I would say the cost has gotten back down to a more normal, predictable level. Our issue is really on finished vehicles, 100%, and I know we're not alone with that. So spending a lot of energy, and I would say, if you ask me my top 5 issues, it's in the top 5, and if you ask my CEO, her top 5, it's in her top 5. Is the need to be able to move the vehicles that we build, and I think there's a number of reasons which we're working directly with our partners on to help, but I think probably some underinvestment, if we're honest, over the last couple of years in some critical assets and capacity. And I think labor struggles that exist everywhere, this is also an industry that's impacted by that as well.
So it's remarkable. Logistics is in the top 5 for you, overseeing global purchasing. You've just told us as well that it's in the top 5 for Mary Barra as a CEO. In fact, I'm hearing it termed in some cases the new chip crisis. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's becoming so critical? Again, from your view from above, what's really the issues there?
Yeah, and I would start with a recognition that we've done a lot of things that have really disrupt the efficiency of that network as well. As you think about us and other OEMs kind of going through COVID and plant closures and building vehicles shy and storing vehicles and disrupting that normal flow of the network, I think that's had an impact, and so we're not shying away from that. I think there's other macro things that are occurring, especially if you look at global ocean. Some of the flows from Asia into North America and other markets in the world, those flows have now really started to change. But I think underlying both, we believe through the last couple of years, there's probably some underinvestment that's happened in specifically railcar capacity for doing finished vehicles. I think for ocean ro-ro vessels, and we're seeing the impacts of that. And if you look at ro-ro vessel capacity, in a lot of cases, we used to sail to the West Coast as well as the East Coast of the U.S. and do drops there. And a lot of the East Coast ports have now stopped, and so we're porting everything on the West Coast and then having to have kind of this rail connect that takes you across the country, and so that's very disruptive to flows. We've got other OEs that have come in that are also taking demand and disrupting those flows. We've disrupted the flows ourselves, and we also know that labor has been an issue for many of our suppliers. I think our railroads are also feeling that impact. I think we've seen numbers in different analysis that it could be as much as a 20% decrease in the number of heads, which certainly hurts the velocity of the networks and just having train crews that can actually operate that. And then finally, when we have this many disruptions, we used to have dedicated automotive trains, and those seem to, in many cases, have been mixed with material, and that hurts the velocity of those routes as well. So I think there's a number of combinations that have kind of led us here. I think we see some inequity in the rail network in terms of allocation of cars and who's contributing and who's not. So we've approached it as from a partner standpoint. We've had good CEO discussions with all the key players and really seeking to understand and try to figure out what's underneath it and what are things that we can do as a partner to help them secure and improve that. I would say that is ongoing work. In the meantime, what we're really looking for is as much self-help as the network can give to help us move vehicles. Because we're at a point where customer demand is still very strong, inventory at dealers is still very low, and we've got vehicles that are basically built and ready to ship that we can't move. And we have got to collectively make the investments and be strategic. And I think, if I look at everything else that we're doing in my space, we can absolutely be longer term, more strategic in almost every aspect of our supply chain setup. So if we need to do things from a haul-away standpoint, from a rail car standpoint, even from an ocean vessel standpoint that secures a longer horizon and a more stable partnership and flow, these are things we're absolutely prepared to do. But we've got to we've got to get over the hump here so we can move the vehicles that we build.
I mean, what you describe in terms of a partnership is really no different to the complexity of getting into it with the battery supply and making the long-term commitments working together. But it needs the engagement from both sides. So yeah. I'm glad to hear you're having the conversations, but we know it has to move from that to real action as well.
Yeah, we understand and we know that these are complex networks. We know that we are one of many players that are involved in these networks, and we know these networks have multiple companies that all need to work together to make it happen. Logistics loves predictability. It loves constant flows. I think those things have not occurred. So all that said, we are trying to understand and figure out how we can be better customers and partners, but that has got to result in some improvement pretty quickly.
We're going to go into more detail on that with some of your team at our conference. I'll just plug it actually, September 26th to 28th in Dearborn, don't miss it. Thanks again for your support on that. But look at trends that we see across GM, but also other manufacturers in North America. Policy push in this direction too. Lots of talk on nearshoring, friend or allied sourcing, etc. How is this, or is this informing your decisions on purchasing?
Yeah, so I would say, and we've talked pretty openly about it, it's resilience is really something that we need to improve. And just going through the crisis, the supply chain crisis and the disruptions that have occurred the last couple of years is pretty obvious that there's an opportunity to be more resilient. And so that kind of starts with looking at where do we have risks and having a more systematic way of looking at supply risks. And I think one of those supply risks that we do measure is dependency risk. And we also look at when you do get into a supply shock or issue, what is the ability to recover from that? And so I think that's naturally identified and probably trended more nearshoring, if you want to call it that, versus what we maybe have today. Just kind of looking at our global footprint and saying, number one, is that the right balance going forward? And then I think secondly, in that same vein, looking at areas of risk or concentrations of risk. So, one of the areas that we started looking at is trying to get deeper into our tiered supplier knowledge. So we know really, really well who all of our tier one suppliers are and where they're located because we basically pick up and manage all the logistics from the majority of them, right? But what we've realized is really important through COVID and the last couple of years is knowing your tier twos, tier threes, tier fours, tier fives. And when you start mapping that down, you realize there's dependencies where you have many suppliers that are sharing the same tier three, tier four. You've got tier threes and tier fours that are really, have a risk profile that maybe isn't what we want. So I think that basis is going to continue. Like we're looking at that. I think it's going to drive a little bit more nearshoring. I think the term ally shoring I hear a lot in the battery world, right? So as we look at our EV strategy, we are I think one of the first OEMs. Maybe there's one other that was a little bit earlier than us, but I think we are highly engaged in getting deep into the value chain and doing that through partnerships. And so you see us with joint ventures announced for doing battery cell manufacturing. So it kind of starts there, and a key part of those agreements are really being able to work together from a GM standpoint to shape what that value chain looks like. And the concentration risk today for mainly processing, material processing. So you think about the critical minerals that go into a battery like lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese. There is some dispersion in terms of where those mined assets are, but there's a high concentration of where it's processed into battery grade materials that go into making cathodes and anode material for the batteries. And so we've, as you map that, it becomes pretty obvious that there's just a intentional need that we all need to do to develop alternate network or alliance of not only the mining but also the processing, so that we've got a good, strong, resilient value chain.
Another area where I think that tier knowledge has really shifted and changed is when we get into semiconductors and obviously what has happened there. I've heard you speak about what I think you call the A word, wanting to avoid allocation things in that kind of sense. You've made some important partnerships, in some cases creating direct relationships, direct corridors for semiconductors. Can you talk a little bit about how that's changed the way you're working with these suppliers, but also, to my mind, at least as importantly, how internally making engineering decisions, design, supply chain decisions?
You know, I think you have to reflect on what it was, you know, when this crisis started, and I think you have to be really honest with yourself, right? And I think if we're honest with ourselves as an automotive industry, and if we're honest with ourselves as GM, as a company, we have not done a good job of managing or placing the importance on semiconductors. And so when this demand shock occurred a couple of years ago, and really everybody working from home and entertaining themselves from home, and this huge demand spike for consumer electronics, these were companies and players that had direct relationships with the semiconductor fabs, and they were able to move very quickly and secure what they needed. If you look at ourselves and the rest of the industry, automotive's at 8 to 10% of the semiconductor industry. We're not an easy 8 or 10%, right? Because we have very long product life cycles, we have a lot of complexity, and even the lack of standardization, just based on really OEMs going through different tier ones and designing differently all the electronic controllers that go throughout the vehicle. And then just the length of time that we require. So you've got this development product cycle that's long, you've got the production life cycle that's long, and then you've got a service life cycle that's long, and this automotive mantra of don't change anything, right? So I think, we've got to be more agile and flexible. We've got to be more responsive to understanding what the semiconductor fabs need. We've got to be intentional about capacity planning, and all those things mean we need to have better relationships, more direct relationships with the key semiconductor partners. And I would say one of the great things that's come out of this is some of our best relationships today are with the semiconductor partners that maybe we didn't have a strong relationship with before, just because we weren't working directly, but we have seen tremendous value just developing that relationship, and it's really helped us improve the current supply situation. And as we look ahead, it's absolutely necessary for everything that we're doing with the electrical architecture and the software architectures in the future to have those direct relationships and to secure that.
Absolutely, and having those direct relationships probably makes it easier to work internally too, because if you're going to make an engineering change, that coordination can be understood better internally and directly with the supplier.
The partnership with engineering is absolutely key, right? And again, if we're really honest with ourselves, when it first started, we really didn't have a core group of engineers that were focused on silicon. We had different engineers in different areas of the business that had that knowledge, but we really didn't have a core team that was focused on it. Likewise, we didn't really have a core team from a procurement and supply chain standpoint that was focused on it. Out of necessity, I think we started to create that team. I think we've seen the value, and we've both committed great resources, people, and heads to staff the teams. And so when I meet and talk with them now, it's a high-powered. We've brought in great talent from the industry, people that really understand how to do this and how to think differently, and really help us reimagine what we do going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and therefore to be able to question why we may in future be able to change the number of chips in certain areas, or simplify without compromising on areas of quality or design.
We have to, as an industry, we have to find a way to simplify. We've got to be able to, and I've talked to almost all the major tier ones. I've talked to colleagues at other OEs. As an industry, we've got to find a way and a path to. There's components on a board that we may collectively use 500, 600 different part number components, where really that could get narrowed down to 5 to 10, right? And those are the types of things that we've got to identify, because that's just complexity that doesn't add any value. It's not good for anybody, and it creates risk. And really hurts the capacity utilization.
But that's exactly the lead into the next question. And as you mentioned in the beginning, chip supply has improved, but it's fragile. And if we look on the horizon, the trajectory for values of chips and things is increasing. So do we still have risk that this bullwhip effect, if you like, could return if we're not careful, if we don't make some of the decisions that you've just sort of outlined?
Yeah. So we're really focused on, and we say it often, controlling our destiny, right? So that means, we want to make sure that we understand what do we need to build the vehicles and the mix of technologies that we have. Technology's changing rapidly, right? And I think there's nobody that knows that better than the GM team to be able to plan that and to be able to give those horizons. And we're giving suppliers, and we're actually committing, 2 to 3 years of capacity reservation because we understand, what our demand needs are, and we're willing to make those commitments. And we also know that that's exactly what the semiconductor industry needs, right? And so we want to be in a position to control our own destiny. Where we do have constraints, even more so, right? So if we have a node that we know is constrained and shared, I do not want to ever be in a position where I'm being allocated because they can only produce 70% of what the industry needs, and we get treated equally to the rest of the industry. I think that's a bad formula.
Controlling your own destiny on that topic, and you mentioned some of the partnerships in the upstream supply chain. So battery, really clearly an area that GM is leading or taking a lead on taking control of its destiny. At such a fast pace, I mean, just in the last year or couple of years, how has it changed the way you work with these partners to accelerate that development?
Yeah, so I would say timing is perfect, right? Because the impacts and the lessons we've learned, about controlling our destiny and what allocation does to a production plan on semiconductors happens at the exact same time where you look at critical minerals for EVs, and you say there's a lot of similarities there, right? So controlling our own destiny, establishing partnerships, really being able to kind of secure the material that we need is important. And with that, we've also we've seen the power of what we've been able to do with a cross-functional supported team managing semiconductors. So of course, I've mentioned engineering and purchasing and supply chain. I'll tell you, manufacturing is also an equal voice at that table, and our after sales that supports all of service for customers. And so they work as a super team to really manage that. We've done the exact same thing from a battery raw material standpoint. So we've got teams and as you can imagine, a lot of these transactions we're making equity investments, we're making loans, we're doing prepayments, we're doing complex agreements, and we're doing a lot of complex agreements. These take time and these take resources. And so one of the first challenges that we saw with it was just the number that we knew that we needed to do and the velocity that we had to do them in, right? And so, we've spent a lot of time setting up, kind of this center of expertise within the company that's got, great finance and M&A resources. We've got, treasury, we've got legal, we've got purchasing, we've got engineering, and so we've got this team that can move really, really fast, and it's got C-suite support, for it and helping us move fast. Board of directors support, The second thing then is, once you've done that, is who are the universe of partners you want to look at, and what areas of the value chain do you want to play in? And so I think this has been an area that has required a lot of technical reflection just to come up with what do we think we need to do. And what you've seen from the announcements, if you start to piece them together, it starts with battery cells and battery cell manufacturing. Big motivation there, several motivations. One is we think we can add a lot to that partnership. As you think about industrializing and building plants, and you think about everybody trying to do this around the world with the same 4 or 5 battery cell partners, these battery cell partners just don't have that scope and breadth, right? So we bring that. We know how to build plants. We know how to do the permitting. We know how to do, staffing. We know how to work with local contractors, and we can do that very quickly. And then we're also an organization that's really good at doing high scale manufacturing with quality and having all those things built in line. And so, but we're also an organization that's got a ton of procurement scale and really knows how to manage supply chains and really knows how to really drive value there. And so starts with battery cells, and really we've kind of mapped it back and said, what are the areas that we want to play in? And so what you've seen are announcements made in the cathode space, partnerships with POSCO, who again is an incredible partner, partnerships with LG Chem to really provide cathode material. But then when you kind of double click on that, you say, okay, well the inputs into those are really critical. And so what are those processed material grades that need to go into those facilities? And you've seen announcements from us on nickel sulfate. You've seen a lot of announcements from a lithium standpoint. So we're looking at brine assets that are also going to do the processed material out in the Salton Sea. You've seen announcements out of Argentina. You've seen Thacker Pass with Lithium America out in Nevada. We're looking at rare earths. So I think we're one of the only OEMs that's really leaning into that and helping to develop U.S.-based rare earth assets that can make EV magnet material. We've brought EV magnet partners to North America to be able to do that. And the list just goes on and on and on. And it's a recognition that we need to be very intentional about what we're doing, and we need to be able to ensure that we've got the capacity that we need secured. And I would say so far so good. We've announced publicly that we've got everything we need to do 1 million vehicles secured through 2025. So as you see a lot of these announcements about new partnerships and new capacity and brick and mortar that's going in, that's really for this kind of next million, right? This through 2030 to kind of get us to there.
This is why I said early on that I thought you were being a bit modest when you say we've got back to basics. Mm-hmm. In reality, quite a lot upstream, as you just outlined. Mm-hmm. So with those partnerships and those investments now, as you just said, is that really the key to get from 1 to 2 million capacity, for example, or to increase, as you said, the 1 million in North America by 2025 mm-hmm. is secure mm-hmm. from materials side. Are there other things as well? Because the technology is also changing so fast. I almost feel like, what is even going to be some of that cell technology design and pack in 2030? So keeping up with that in parallel.
So it's one of the biggest challenges, right? So you're trying to, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to build in agility and flexibility into how you're capacitizing. So I think the other thing that we're really intentional about is we think we can cover, if you look at what the expected cell chemistries are throughout the decade. And I think we envision that there'll probably be low energy density chemistries, mid energy density chemistries, and high energy density chemistries. And those require different levels of nickel and cobalt and manganese, depending on what those chemistry blends are. Chemistries like LFP, we think these all have a place in the portfolio. And so what we want to do is we want to have partners that have the flexibility and the assets that we're partnered in to be able to do multiple chemistries and to not overinvest in a chemistry assuming that's going to be 100%. And so it's a work in progress. It's not easy to do, but we know that technology is going to continue to evolve very rapidly, and so we're trying to secure the amount that we need, but also giving ourselves the flexibility to keep incrementing every 2 to 3 years as the tech develops.
So one of the key aspects, I think, in achieving that, and you alluded to this, is working closely with suppliers and, mm-hmm. and having those new kinds of partnerships. In some cases, more complex, as you've alluded to too, in terms of the investments that are required. Mm-hmm. But there as well, it seems we've had some progress. I would cite the Plant Moran index that recently came out, which did show some pretty significant improvements mm-hmm. for GM. To what would you attribute some of this improvement? Yeah,
back on kind of the our EV partners that we have in the value chain. One of the things I'm proudest of is these are all companies that are actually great partners, all the way up to their senior leader level, right? And there's a lot of companies that we've walked away from as we've gotten into negotiations because they weren't looking for partnership. They believed there was or their shareholders believed there was an opportunity in the market, and they were looking to extract all the value from it, and that's not really partnership. And so I'm happy the way we've evolved as a purchasing organization, that we can really focus on selecting who it is that we're going to work with and making sure that we're doing that in a partner way. And I think, if you go back in our history, that's not how we behaved. If you look at the Plant Moran Working Relations Index, going back 20 years, I always point that we had the very low point on that chart for all the OEMs back in 2005, I think it was, right? We have put a ton of effort and a ton of energy into improving supplier relationships, and I think one of the unique things that we do is we actually, again, trying to be intentional, we score it. So when we think about partnerships and measuring performance, we have a two-dimensional supplier scorecard that we use, right? So we measure business performance like we always have and everybody does. We actually measure cultural performance as well. And we ask the suppliers to also rate us from a cultural performance standpoint. So every one of our commodity teams and every one of our key suppliers sit down at least once a year and talk about how we scored them and how they scored us, and it ends up being this great, sometimes brutal conversation about how do we get better. And it's something that I think we started in 2015. If you look at the results on the Plant Moran, you certainly saw a pretty big shift over those couple of years. It's probably been flat since then, but I think we were pretty. So 297 was the number this year. I know it's 297 because we actually have that number plastered all around the floor. So I think the team is really, really proud of achieving that number. I think it's consistency. I think it's knowing that this isn't something that's going to go up or down. It's not something that we're going to decommit from and change how we're working. If I look at the top two that are in that survey, Toyota and Honda, I would say these are companies that have been extraordinarily consistent over a long period of time in terms of how they work with suppliers and how those relationships are, right? And I think if you look at this year's survey, the separation, the drop with some of the other Detroit OEs is pretty dramatic. And again, it just makes me really proud of us working the right way and doing things how they should.
One of the things that survey and its authors specifically pointed out was sometimes for suppliers it's a little confusing, as OEMs split divisions, create spin-offs, JVs, and of course these are things that GM is doing as well. I mean, for me, as someone who covers supply chain, I always look at that and think, yeah, but you don't want to lose your scale, right?
Right.
Will GM purchasing, supply chain, logistics, still stay at that central level, even as it understandably focuses and splinters in other areas?
Yeah, we try to be intentional. We try to have a central decentral type of model. So we have a very, very strong central team that's doing procurement for commodities and automotive parts across the vehicle. And then we've got obviously the supply chain logistics teams that support that. However, if you look at startup types of businesses like GM Defense, or if you look at what we're doing with GM Energy, if you look at even BrightDrop, these are areas, growth businesses, and so we want to make sure that we allow them the ability to have the autonomy they need to be able to go fast and to get to market with really kind of innovative, great products. And so we don't want to encumber them with maybe some of the process and bureaucracy that goes with the bigger central organization. But what the balance we always try to strike is, listen, you can be a nimble startup with an 800-pound gorilla really helping you in the background. And there's just tremendous synergy when we do that the right way. And certain things like, a lot of the larger kind of IT and software agreements that we have as a company, they have full access to all of that. We can help them with logistics. We can help them with electronics purchases. Yet they still have the autonomy to kind of go and do what they need to do to go fast. And I think it's a good model. The other thing that happens is we actually get some learnings about startups and what they're doing to go fast, and we can kind of go back and challenge some of our own processes. And there's been a lot of cases where we actually have made some changes that I think are for the better.
You talked a lot about what's happening in the value chain, and clearly that's driving make-buy decisions and some of the key areas like cells, cathodes, and the materials and minerals that you mentioned. Do you see a shifting balance as well in sort of other key components, modules, when you start breaking down that supply chain further? Yeah. Inverters, EV motors, battery trays and packs. Is that still kind of a moving feast, if you like, in terms of what comes in and what gets outsourced?
I would say that the start of our Ultium platform, the idea with the Ultium platform was on one skateboard, single layer, double layer packs, scale the number of modules in each layer, different drive units. You could really mix and match and get a number of vehicles across a number of segments, from kind of smaller SUVs all the way to trucks like the Hummer, right? You can get them out to market very quickly, very standardized. I think as we go forward, that evolves likely, right? I mean, there's probably different skateboards for different segments. I think the skateboard starts to evolve. I think some of the technology in it starts to evolve. We don't have a rigid make versus buy. Other than I think we're always looking at what's the right decision from a total kind of value standpoint. We know that the technology is going to continue to move. We may want to, if you take inverters as an example, you've seen us working directly in the silicon area there. So, trends towards silicon IGBTs moving into silicon carbide MOSFETs. We know that the capacity is not there for silicon carbide MOSFETs, and we, along with many others, are going that direction fast. So that's an area that we've got to go in and make sure that we're kind of securing. Does that then start to translate into us doing work more directly with power modules? As a buy, do we start thinking about doing any of that in-house ourselves? Do we think about invert? I don't know, right? I think what we need to do is just make sure that we all keep an open mind. We keep looking at kind of where technology is leading us, and then just make good decisions on whether we want to, how much we want to vertically integrate in those areas.
We've been focusing, understandably, a lot on chip and EV, but of course a large share of the supply chain and purchasing you're overseeing is still in ICE and traditional suppliers. Some of them recent announcements, big investments in the plants like Flint and stuff, which continue to build very, very important products and will do for some time to come in the ICE area. Yeah. How are you ensuring that the supply chain focus on innovation and performance holds up in these business segments, even as you move so deeply into new ones?
Yeah, I mean, we have incredible ICE product today, right? And very profitable and very important to the business. And it's something that we actually have to constantly kind of message and communicate the importance of that, because you get caught up sometimes really just talking and looking ahead about something new that you need to build, right, in terms of EV and all the EV infrastructure that you need. All that said, I think there's different progressions on what the curve looks like, right? But I think we all know it's going to be a downward curve, and I think the challenge that we have is really, what are our suppliers thinking as we move forward, right? And so we're having a lot of discussion trying to and we've seen a lot of examples where a lot of our big suppliers are looking at divisions that do ICE products, and they're making investments in divisions that are more focused on EV products. And in some cases, they're looking at divesting that. They're looking, you've got financial investors that are coming in, and they don't always have the same long view. And there's tough work ahead, right, in terms of managing that curve and the capacity and plant closures and redeployment of people that need to go with it. So we're worried about that. We're worried about there is need for investment. This is if you look at, we'll be doing likely some new engines, to support some of our capacity here going forward, and there'll be emissions upgrades that are going to be required to do along the way. So there's still work needed in ICE area, and there's still investment needed in the ICE area. And so we want to make sure that we're we're working with partners that are going to continue to do that. And so we talk a lot about kind of consolidators and consolidatees, and it's the companies that are looking to divest and kind of get out of it. The earlier we're going to have those discussions in a productive way, and then also be talking in parallel to the companies that really have a lot of interest in kind of aggregating this as you go forward and kind of filling the capacity, that are still willing to make the investments, that still see the importance of it. I think it's going to be really critical. But it's, as you can imagine, it's really complex to think through and do. So I think where we've started is, let's just make sure, again, as partners, we're having great communication with our partners, right? To really understand what they're thinking, what we're thinking, what the portfolios of both look like, and through that, I think we've seen wins already in terms of where we can do something that's in the interest of both, that kind of helps us move along.
And really direct partnership there too, as you say, because GM probably will have an expertise to bring to help some of those suppliers who are willing to make the investments and partnerships, whether changing skills, changing facilities, processes, etc. That seems to be really important. But as long as they're ready to step up, it sounds like GM is certainly ready to step up too.
Yes, yeah, we know it's something we need to be great partners about as we go forward. If you just leave it to the contracts and let that play out, we're probably not going to get to the right answer.
Zooming back out, because obviously across the enterprise, total enterprise cost has been a philosophy at GM for a process at GM for a long time. I remember us talking about that more than 10 years ago when you had leading loads in logistics. How has that changed now, today, in the context of assessing purchasing decisions, perhaps also tools, data analytics, different AI, different ways you can enhance that?
Yeah, so I would say it's ingrained in the culture, number one, where 10 years ago we were still trying to get everybody to accept what needed to change in order to get focused on total enterprise cost. So it's very ingrained in the culture, but it still remains difficult to do on a day-to-day basis because there's always a special circumstance, there's always an urgency, and there's always shortcuts that you're at risk of doing. So I would say it's a constant area that we need to focus on. Our tools and processes have improved quite a bit for it. So I would say one of the big trends that we've had is really moving from a more transactional way of purchasing material to being able to be more strategic with partners. And part of being strategic is having this shared understanding of cost modeling and what things should cost, and using that as a basis to really negotiate and contract. And what that enables you to do is really work with partners in a much different way, much earlier in the process, and being able to bring those things forward. As you can imagine, it's easy to say, it's difficult to do, especially when you think about doing that consistently across a big organization. So we've developed a lot of systems and tools, I would say mainly in-house, from that standpoint, looking at how do we do this in a more scaled, consistent fashion across different commodities and different regions, and how do we update those for, as economics change, as we see labor costs increasing, as we see FX increasing or changing around the globe. How do we to do that? So we've built some sophisticated tools there. I would say from an AI machine learning standpoint, we've done a lot of work in maybe the analytics space. If you think about the big data that exists in an organization like this, it's massive. And starting with just how do we scorecard and measure and rate everything, and it's bringing all these different data sets together. But then, how do you gain business insights that actually lead to things that drive performance and productivity and efficiency? And so that's where we've really found a lot of the AI machine learning tools to help us out. Now, some of the areas, we've looking at warranty and how do we early detect, and how do we really make sure that we're finding warranty issues before we wait for a spike in incidents or costs that come in, and continue to look at other areas like that.
We started off earlier talking about resiliency. Obviously, that's been a key objective across the industry, and certainly at GM. In parallel, we have higher interest rates. We have lots of situations which, of course, continue to drive cost, which, as I always point out to people, the lean supply chain doesn't go away. Lean isn't going away. Aspects of just in time, whatever you want to call it. It's a balance now between lean and resiliency. From your view, looking over the organization and supply chain, are you thinking about how you strike that balance between lean and resiliency? Is it something that is changing or driving decisions in the supply chain?
Yeah, no, it is, and we talk a lot about it. I don't think we have a strategy that says we're just going to increase the buffers and create lots of warehouse space and inventory versus what we have today.
Sorry, warehouse providers.
Yes, I do think there's some, right? So we are doing, we're looking at some cases where we need to increase the resiliency, and we're looking at having more days on hand. In a lot of cases, we need to, the issue with automotive is twofold. One is just the bulk of the material, right? When you talk about having a few days on hand inventory, that it gets really expensive in terms of where do you hold it, how do you have racks and containers to take care of it, and then it's just very expensive inventory. So that's this leanness that's kind of built into the just-in-time automotive mantra, right? It has good reason for it, right? However, we have looked at things where maybe we were too lean in the past, and maybe we didn't have the minimum robustness that we should have had, right? We've looked at, even as we move material Mexico north, the volatility of maybe border crossing timings and some of the things there that in the past we would kind of live with, and if we had a disruption, we'd put parts into the air. I think we've kind of looked at that differently and said, maybe that's an area that we need to kind of think about, increasing the robustness. I think we talked about overseas supply in a lot of cases. That's a tough balance, right? Because on one hand, you say there may be a resilience play or decision that says we want to move that stuff here in North America. You actually reduce your finished good inventory that's in float. So like as we had these overseas disruptions, you think, oh God, this is really bad. Well, it's not bad if you have 8 weeks on the water, right? And then you have a ton of material that you can, So it's a balance. It's not a one size fit all. I think when it's all said and done, what you're probably going to see is, I don't think our inventory carrying cost for material will be all that different than what it is today. I think you'll probably see some shift in, maybe we can be leaner in certain areas, maybe the footprint will make us leaner in certain areas, and maybe we need to be a little bit more robust in others.
And you do always need to see that full picture, because as you said, bringing something onshore or locally, might eliminate some of the natural buffers that get built in. It also brings other requirements, other infrastructure that is needed. So
Sure.
Seeing that whole kind of view. Thanks again for so much input here. We're coming close to the end, but one thing perhaps I haven't touched upon enough is the carbon zero targets and initiatives. We just saw a recent one as well on steel recently, but in purchasing now, what role or are emissions and renewable factors, becoming much more decisive? Will it become more? Can you give us a sense of how that looks in terms of the KPIs and metrics?
Yeah, and again, I'm proud of what we're doing as an organization. I think we're leaning in hard to it. We've some of the things we've kicked off here recently in the last 1 to 2 years is an ESG pledge that we've asked suppliers to sign and kind of get on board with us. With that comes carbon reporting and also ESG reporting through EcoVadis and carbon calculator. And these are both areas that, from our perspective, it's really important to start measuring something, because I think once you're measuring, you naturally start to see where there's opportunities and where you could make two different decisions, and you can make one and put some value on doing something that's better for the planet, right? And I think we've had great reception to it. So if I look at the number of suppliers that are doing reporting for us, we're probably close to 90% of our spend tied up with those suppliers. If you look at some of the announcements we've done, traditional commodities like steel, we've worked with almost all of our major steel mills and producers to do grades of green steel, and I think throughout the commodity space, we've really looked at any areas that we have. We do something, and we've got this very innovative group that's just thinking of different ways that we can help drive value and create value. And we started this program called Energy Treasure Maps, and We actually have a team of people that go in and work with suppliers and basically do on-site assessments and say where are there opportunities where you actually could reduce your energy consumption in the facility, right? And it's great for the planet. It's also great for business, right? Because they're reducing their costs and their energy consumption and usage. And I think we did 8 of them a couple of years ago, and we kind of challenged the team last year to scale that up and do 80 last year. I think they're now looking at how do we go to 800, right? So it's this momentum that you build, right? And I think once you start seeing value and you see that you're doing something that actually has an impact, it gets everybody really excited about doing it. And we just have to drive that as a cultural priority throughout our supply base and let them know that this is something that's really important from a GM standpoint, that as we kind of move towards an EV future, we want to make sure that we've got a clean supply chain that goes along with that. And we're here to partner and kind of help them work through that.
To conclude, what would your advice be to suppliers who want to partner better with GM, who want to win business, but obviously in a long-term basis? What's some of your parting advice for suppliers, logistics providers, whoever you want to focus?
I would say we talk a lot about build relationships before you need them. And I think that's a very true statement. And if you don't have great relationships or partnerships with the GM team today, start today, right? And start building those. And I think what's important for us, and we'll make it really clear, is the partner behaviors, the transparency, the drive and focus on innovation and technology, and really making sure that we're bringing kind of quality and excellence to everything that we're doing. So make sure that you're doing all those things, but also make sure that you got the right partnerships with GM, that we're managing issues in the right way together, and do that now versus waiting until there's a piece of business that you're trying to bid for, and you're somebody that maybe doesn't have that same partnership level that you have. And then I think just look ahead as well and think about what we're going to need in the future and where are those critical areas that are really going to create a ton of value and unlock things. We're on a very strong path to try to maximize the value that we have in our electric vehicles, and part of that is how do we drive costs down and how do we get more efficiency and performance out of the offering. We've got to help build out the charge network across the nation and make sure that we've got charging for you when you're using vehicles for road trips. We've got to make sure we've got the right infrastructure in your home, this reimagining of the grid and all the possibilities that are there, and then this shift to really a different electrical architecture in the vehicle where instead of having discrete controllers that have hardware and embedded software within it that are doing some functionality, it's just a completely different game, and it's thinking about where can you create value and how do we partner differently in the future. And that's it's the companies that are really hearing that and thinking about how that can look different and having the discussions with us about how can we partner together to do something that we're trying to do. Those are the ones that I think are going to have a great advantage here going forward.
It's such a strong point and a great one about building those relationships with the right people. Mm-hmm. As we've heard over our discussion, this tour de force across the supply chain, it's complex. It's getting more complex. But if suppliers work with the right people at GM, I think there's a lot they can learn and work together. Mm-hmm. Perhaps I can also use that as a last opportunity to mention where to build some of the relationships in logistics too, because you have a great team there led by Renee Warzinski, Dave Leach on the supply chain side, both of whom will be at our Automotive Logistics and Supply Chain Global Conference. And I hope that, along with other members of the team, I hope our audience takes an opportunity to delve into some of these very complex issues with the team there. But for our global audience in manufacturing and supply, a great message, I think, to take away and really understand these topics. Thank you so much for taking the time to give us all this insight, to get under the skin of it with us. We really appreciate it, and we're excited to see what the next 15 months bring and beyond.
Indeed. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much,
I
Jeff.
appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes.